The Dolly Pit was a scoria mining operation located about 13 miles northwest of Gillette, Wyoming. Run by Jim's Water Service, it was a small-scale site with just 3 workers handling one 12-hour shift a day, 6 days a week. The main objective was straightforward: extract scoria, a rough reddish volcanic rock, used primarily for road construction due to its porous nature, which allowed it to lock into place without compaction, providing stability for roadbeds and drainage systems. The pit was a noisy, dusty place. Bulldozers extracted the rock, front-end loaders transported it, and a primary jaw crusher reduced it to consistent sizes. This equipment required regular maintenance to function safely, particularly for the loaders, which were crucial for moving material efficiently. On January 12, 2002, the crew at the Dolly Pit included Ronald Parks, Jerry Weaver, and Douglas Lee Rockefeller, or Doug. Doug's task was to operate the primary jaw crusher, ensuring it ran smoothly without any jams or overheating. Ronald fed raw scoria into the crusher using a loader, while Jerry used a Caterpillar Model 966C front-end loader to move the processed rock to the stockpile. The 3 of them worked efficiently amidst the noise and dust, each focused on their part of the process. Now around 9:30 a.m., Jerry loaded up a bucket of scoria and drove the loader up the inclined ramp to the stockpile area. He dumped the load without issue, but as he started to reverse down the ramp, the engine suddenly stalled. The Caterpillar Model 966C used at the pit was a heavy-duty machine with an air-over-hydraulic braking system. This system relied on compressed air to apply pressure to hydraulic lines, ensuring the loader could stop safely. However, with the engine stalled, the air compressor that maintained pressure for the brakes was cut off. Worse still, the brake control valves were leaking air rapidly, which meant that even if the engine had been running, the brakes would have been unreliable. The parking brake, meant as a failsafe, was also found to be ineffective, incapable of holding the loader on even modest slopes. As a result, the 12-ton loader began rolling backward down the incline, with no way to stop it. The roar of the crusher and the general clamor of the pit masked the sound of the loader's wheels skidding on the gravel. At the bottom of the ramp, Doug was standing near his parked pickup truck. He might have been checking something on the crusher or preparing for the next task. Whatever the case, he had no warning that the loader was barreling toward him. By the time he might have seen it, it was too late. The loader rolled down the 200-foot incline and slammed into Doug, pinning him between the loader and his truck. The impact was immediate and brutal. Jerry, realizing something was horribly wrong, climbed out of the cab and ran over. The sight was horrific. He shouted for Ronald and someone called 911. Paramedics arrived quickly and rushed Doug to Campbell County Memorial Hospital in Gillette, but the injuries were too severe. Doug was pronounced dead on arrival, with the cause listed as severe blood loss from crushing injuries to his chest, abdomen, and pelvis. In the aftermath, the Mine Safety and Health Administration launched an investigation into the incident. As the federal agency responsible for enforcing safety and health regulations in mining, they required all mining operations to notify them upon starting to issue proper safety inspections. However, Jim's Water Service had never informed the agency about the Dolly Pit's operations, bypassing mandatory safety checks and avoiding inspections that might have identified the equipment failures. The investigation's findings were damning. Maintenance records, or the lack thereof, suggested that regular safety checks of air pressure levels, brake line integrity, and emergency systems were either skipped or poorly documented. Proper maintenance should have ensured that the loader could stop safely, even if the engine was stalled. Combined with the loader's known tendency to stall under stress, the failure to address these issues made it a disaster waiting to happen. Further scrutiny revealed that none of the workers, including Doug, had received the required safety training. The agency mandates comprehensive training for all mining personnel, covering emergency response, equipment operation, and hazard recognition. Proper training might have helped the crew respond more effectively when the loader's brakes failed. In addition to these violations, the agency cited the company for failing to report the start of mining operations, a clear breach of federal law. The failure to report not only avoided safety inspections, but also suggested an attempt to cut costs by skirting regulatory oversight. As a result, the company faced multiple citations and substantial fines, along with orders to overhaul its safety practices completely. Two friends went to the bar to drink on a warm August night in 2004. John Kemper Hutchinson, 21 years old, and his friend Francis Daniel, 23 years old, or Frankie. They had been close for years. That night, they drove to a bar in suburban Atlanta, Georgia, with plans to spend the evening drinking and talking. The bar was busy and filled with the usual crowd. The two friends spent hours drinking, their laughter and voices growing louder as the night wore on. By closing time, both were visibly intoxicated. The bartender had offered to call a cab, but John waved it off, insisting he was fine to drive. Frankie, too drunk to argue, climbed into the passenger seat of John's 1986 Chevrolet Blazer. The drive home should have been a short one, just a few miles along familiar roads. The streets were dark and mostly empty, the occasional street lamp casting pools of dim light on the pavement. John's driving was erratic, the Blazer weaving slightly as he struggled to focus. His blood alcohol level was way above the legal limit, which impaired his coordination and reaction times. Frankie leaned out of the passenger side window, possibly to get some air, his body swaying slightly with the motion of the vehicle. John's speed increased as he drove down the road, tires humming against the asphalt. He didn't notice when the wheels slipped a little too close to the edge of the pavement. The right tires dropped off the roadway, kicking up gravel, and John jerked the wheel in a panicked overcorrection. The Blazer veered sharply to the left, tires screeching as it swerved onto the pavement. The sudden movement was violent, causing the passenger side to swing outward. Frankie, still leaning out of the window, was left exposed to the roadside obstacles. The vehicle neared along the narrow shoulder, and in an instant, Frankie's head struck a support wire for a telephone pole, a thick steel cable strung taut alongside the road. The impact was fatal, resulting in his decapitation. Blood splattered across the passenger side of the Blazer and onto John, who was still behind the wheel. The windshield was cracked. It was a horrific sight. John, heavily intoxicated and in shock, continued to drive. Now, it is unclear if he fully understood what had happened at that moment, or if his drunken state clouded his ability to process the reality of the situation. He drove for approximately 12 miles, eventually pulling into his driveway without stopping to check on his friend or call for help. John turned off his car, then stumbled inside his house, leaving the car door open, the dome light casting a dull glow over the blood-streaked interior. He collapsed into bed and his blood-stained clothes, the alcohol dulling any realization of the horror that had just unfolded. The following morning, a neighbor out for a walk noticed the Blazer parked unevenly in the driveway with the passenger side door open. The blood on the side of the vehicle and the body slumped in the seat made it immediately clear that something was horribly wrong. The neighbor contacted the police, voice trembling as they tried to explain what they were seeing. Police and emergency services arrived quickly, blocking off the driveway and covering the vehicle with a tarp to shield the scene from gathering onlookers. When officers woke John and brought him outside, he appeared disoriented and confused, still wearing his clothes from the night before, now stiff with dried blood. His eyes were red and unfocused, the smell of alcohol still heavy on his breath. Officers questioned him briefly before arresting him on the spot, cuffing his hands behind his back and leading him to a squad car. He was taken to the station for questioning, where it became evident that he was still too drunk to fully understand what had happened. Forensic analysis conducted at the scene confirmed that Frankie's death was caused by the collision with a support wire. The medical examiner's report detailed the extent of the injuries, emphasizing the lethal nature of the impact. Investigators also measured the skid marks on the road, determining that the Blazer had been traveling well above the speed limit at the time of the accident. John was charged with vehicular homicide, driving under the influence, and failing to stop at the scene of a fatal accident. In court, the prosecution argued that John's decision to drive drunk displayed a clear disregard for human life, warranting the maximum penalty. Despite their grief, Frankie's family asked the judge for leniency. His mother told the judge that John was like a son to them, that what had happened was a tragedy, not an act of malice. They spoke about the years of friendship between the two men, the memories now stained by that single night. The judge, visibly moved by their plea, took the request for leniency under advisement. John was later sentenced to 5 years in prison. Crosby Excavating Inc., a Fort Wayne-based company, was contracted for a storm sewer project in Columbia City, Indiana, in August 2020. The project involved installing new pipelines and maintaining existing ones, which required accessing manholes to perform inspections and routine maintenance. These manholes were narrow, vertical shafts leading to underground chambers designed to manage stormwater flow. One of these manholes was about 20 feet deep and contained approximately 5 feet of water at the bottom. The interior was dark, humid, and claustrophobic, with walls that echoed every sound, making it difficult to communicate with anyone above ground. Confined spaces like this present significant risks due to limited ventilation, potential toxic gases, and oxygen-deficient environments. Even brief exposure to such conditions can be fatal. Federal safety regulations mandate specific safety measures before workers enter, including atmospheric testing, ventilation, and the use of personal protective equipment such as respirators. 3 workers from Crosby Excavating Inc. were assigned to enter the manhole. They were identified as John R. Ball and his son Bronson Ball, both from Columbia City, and Douglas M. Kramer from Fort Wayne. Their task involved inspecting the interior of the storm sewer system and ensuring that it was clear of obstructions. The crew was familiar with this type of work and had likely carried out similar tasks in the past. However, their familiarity with the job could not protect them from these dangers that lay hidden below. As they descended into the manhole, they were unaware of the deadly hazard awaiting them. The atmosphere inside was oxygen deficient, an invisible danger that cannot be seen, smelled, or felt until it was too late. The confined space, combined with the stagnant air, had allowed oxygen levels to drop significantly. Without proper atmospheric testing to warn them, the men began to breathe in the oxygen-poor air. Within seconds, the effects of oxygen deprivation set in: dizziness, confusion, and a loss of coordination. Their chests would have tightened as their lungs struggled to draw in air that wasn't there, a suffocating and terrifying realization that something was terribly wrong. As their bodies fought for air, they would have felt an overwhelming panic. Their limbs would have grown heavy, thoughts sluggish, making even the simplest movements a monumental effort. The darkness of the manhole, combined with a sudden weakness, would have turned the space into a disorientating maze with no way out. Unable to understand what was happening or climb back out, each of them quickly lost consciousness. As they fell, the 5 feet of water at the bottom of the manhole became an inescapable trap. Unconscious and submerged, they were unable to keep their heads above water. In those final moments of consciousness, their instincts would have driven them to gasp for air, only to draw in water instead. The confined space of the manhole made it impossible to alert their colleagues above ground. By the time anyone realized that something was wrong, it was already far too late. Their colleagues above, growing concerned after hearing nothing for several minutes, called emergency services. Rescue teams arrived quite fast, but confined space rescues are perilous even for professionals. The rescuers had to act cautiously, fearing that the same hazardous atmosphere that claimed the 3 workers could also take them out too. As they pulled them in from the water, it was clear that the lack of breathable air and the rising water had sealed their fate. Paramedics did try to revive them, but the damage caused by oxygen deprivation and drowning was irreversible. There was an investigation launched into the incident that day. Like I said in the beginning, there was no atmospheric testing or ventilation that had been carried out that day, and the workers entered the manhole without any warnings of the hazards inside and without any protective equipment such as respirators or harnesses. After those damning findings, the agency that launched the investigation imposed a fine of $14,400 on Crosby Excavating Inc. for these violations. While the fine was intended to enforce compliance with safety regulations, for the families of Jason, Bronson, and Douglas, it was a small price to pay for what had been lost.
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please drive home carefully and come back again soon. Good night.